Chapter 15 of J.S. Bach, Volume 1, by Albert Schweitzer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed by Jonathan Schofield. J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. Chapter 15. The Clavier Works. The clavier works, like those for the organ, mostly date from the Weimar and Cothen periods. Bach, however, published only the great works of the Leipzig period. 6 large partitas, the Italian concerto, 4 duets, and the Goldberg variations. Partitas, not suites, though this is what they really are in form, was the name he gave to the works in the style of his predecessor Kuhnau, who had issued, in 1869 and 1695, 2 collections of Klavierübungen, each containing 7 clavichord partitas. The first partita appeared in 1726. It was the first composition that Bach published. He was at that time 41 years old. Each following year saw the birth of a new partita of his. When 6 of them had appeared, he united them under the title of Klavierübung, Part 1, again in imitation of his predecessor. Übung means here, of course, not so much a work for students' practice as one for diversion. If Bach's sons informed Forkel correctly, the work made a great sensation in the musical world. Such excellent clavichord compositions had never before been seen or heard. Anyone who learned to play a few pieces out of them well could make a great success with them. The second part of the Klavierübung, consisting of the Italian concerto and the B minor partita, was published in Nuremberg in 1735 by Christoph Weigel. Even Schreiber could not help paying a tribute of admiration to the Italian concerto. It is interesting to note that Bach got the idea of the work from a sinfonia in Muffat's Florilegium Primum, 1695. The similarity of the themes is too striking to be explained by mere chance. Muffat. Bach. In 1739, the third part of the Klavierübung appeared. It was intended to contain only organ works, the preludes on the catechism hymns, the 4 clavichord duets got in by mistake. These organ pieces could be played, of course, on the 2-manual pedal clavicembalo, which was very popular at that time. How these great works were received by organists is not recorded. The fourth part of the Klavierübung was also published in Nuremberg, not by Weigel, however, but by Balthasar Schmidt, who was also Emmanuel's publisher. It contained the Goldberg variations. Goldberg was the clavichenist of Count Kaiserling, a patron of Bach, who acted as Russian envoy at the Dresden court. It was he who procured Bach the appointment of court composer. At any rate, the diploma came through his hands. Goldberg was a pupil of Friedemann, who was in Dresden at that time. When he went to Leipzig with his master, which according to Forkel often happened, he visited Bach to learn what he could from him. Forkel gives the following account of the origin of the variations. Count Kaiserling fell very ill and could not sleep at night. Goldberg, who lived with him, had on these occasions to spend the night in an adjoining room so as to be able to play to him when sleepless. Once the Count said that he would like Bach to write some clavichord pieces for Goldberg of a quiet and at the same time cheerful character that would brighten him up a little on his sleepless nights. Bach thought the best thing for the purpose would be some variations, a form which he had previously thought a rather little bit of by reason of the persistence of the same basic harmony throughout. The Count afterwards always called them his variations. He could not hear them often enough, and for a long time, whenever he had a sleepless night, it was, dear Goldberg, play me one of my variations." Bach was perhaps never so well rewarded for any of his works as for this. The Count gave him a golden goblet containing 100 louis d'or. That Bach had no particular fondness for the variation form may be gathered from the fact that apart from the Goldberg set, the only variations he wrote were the youthful aria variata alla maniera italiana. B.G. 36, pages 203 to 208. In his organ music also he soon ceased to write variations on chorale melodies. The theme of the Goldberg variations is found in the Klavierbuchlein of Anna Magdalena Bach, 1725. It is the saraband that follows the song Bist du bei mir. It has been in existence at least 10 years before he thought of writing variations on it. The variations, however, are founded less on the theme itself than on its bass. Over this Bach's imagination plays freely, and the work is in reality more than a passacaglia worked out in chiaroscuro than a series of variations. It is impossible to take to the work at a first hearing. We have to get to know it, and to understand the music of Bach's last period, in which the interest resides not so much in the charm of this or that melodic part as in the free and masterly working out of the ideas. When once we arrive at this standpoint, we can savor the gentle, consoling cheerfulness that gives such warmth to these seemingly artificial pieces. In the last variation, the cheerfulness becomes laughter of the merriest kind. Two folk songs disport themselves in it. Kraut und Rüben haben mich vertrieben, hat mein Mutter Fleisch gekocht, so war ich langer blieben. Ich bin so lang nicht bei dir gewesen, Rückher, Rückher, Rückher. Thus Bach in his old age returns to the quodlibet with which his ancestors used to enjoy themselves so hugely in their great family gatherings. Of all Bach's works, this comes the closest to the modern pianoforte style. If their authorship were not known, anyone would take the penultimate and antepenultimate variations, even from the mere look of them on paper, to be works of Beethoven's last period. The Goldberg variations, the Italian concerto, and the accompanying partita are written for the clavicembalo with two keyboards. Even without a positive statement to this effect, anyone would soon realize it in performance, in the difficulty for one keyboard of the passages in which the hands become entangled. It is strange that Bach did not think of publishing some of his other clavier works. The well-tempered clavichord, indeed, was out of the question, it was too large. A copy, according to the prices of that day, would have cost at least $10 or $15. Why, however, were the French and the English suites not published? Perhaps because they did not strike him as sufficiently difficult and ingenious. As he could permit himself the trouble and luxury of an engraved issue only in a very limited degree, he preferred to expend on them works that would win him honor and recognition among professional musicians and connoisseurs. As compositions in those days, however, were valued less for their aesthetic qualities than for their ingenuity, it would have benefited Bach to have published these simple suites. Nevertheless, it is a mistake to suppose that his other clavier works were not widely diffused. They were obtainable in manuscript copies. After 1720, indeed, there was scarcely a good German musician anywhere who did not possess at least one work of J.S. Bach. As early as 1717, in his book Das Beschützer Orchester, Mattheson reckons the celebrated Weimar organist Herr Johann Sebastian Bach among the leading composers on the grounds of some works of his that he had seen. Besides the 7 partitas that appeared in the Klavierübung, Bach wrote 15 other suites, the 6 French, the 6 English, and 3 smaller suites that may have been sketches for the French. It is not known how the French and English suites acquired these names. Even Forkel could give no precise information on the point. He conjectures that the former were so called because they are written in the French style, and the latter because the composer wrote them for an Englishman of quality, which latter was certainly not the case. At a later date, an unsuccessful attempt was made to give the partitas the title of German suites. The French suites figure, though not quite complete, in the first Klavierbuchlein of Anna Magdalena Bach, 1722. There is also an autograph of them with the inscription Sex suites pour le clavecin composé par Monsieur J.S. Bach. The title of the autograph of the English suites is also in French, but written more correctly. There is a very valuable copy of the 2 collections of suites in Gerber's handwriting, made between 1725 and 1726, when he was a pupil of Bach. The French suites can be proved to be not later in date than the Cotton period. The English suites also, in all likelihood, belong to the same time, though all the manuscripts and the copies that we have of them fall within the first Leipzig period. In the first year of his work at St. Thomas's, Bach had to write a new cantata for almost every Sunday, so that he could have had little time for other works. The suite owes its origins to the pipers of the 17th century, who used to string together various national dances. The German clavichord players adopted the form from them and developed it. The rule was that it should consist of at least 4 pieces: the allemande, the courante, the sarabande, and the gigue. The allemande is in easy 4/4 time, with a quaver or semi-quaver upbeat. The courante or courante is in 3/2 time and is characterized by its uninterrupted sequences of equal notes. The sarabande is a grave Spanish dance, also in 3/2 time, the heavy notes of which are surrounded by coquettish embellishments. The gigue as a rule goes evenly and rapidly, and may be in all kinds of triple rhythms. It gets its name from the gigue, ham or gamon, the satirical French name for the older violins. Thus a gigue really means a fiddler's dance. There was no reason for refusing admission to the suite to the other dance forms that cropped up later. The French, especially Marchand and Couperin, made a point of introducing all possible dances. Their suites contain the gavotte in 2/2 time with a half-beat uptake, the minuet in simple triple rhythm, the passe-pierre, a Breton dance similar to the minuet, which under Louis XIV made its way into the French ballet, the bourrée in quick 4/4 time, an angular dance originating in Auvergne. The French also incorporated into their suites the rondeau, the rigodon, the polonaise, and even independent movements in no particular dance form. Bach takes all these rich suite forms over from his French models, but preserves moderation where they run to extremes. He follows tradition in placing the dances that were not originally part of the suite between the sarabande and the gigue, so that the latter forms the conclusion. He generally places the extraneous movements at the beginning. Thus the English suites open with preludes, and the great partitas in the Klavierübung with preludes, symphonies, fantasias, overtures, preambles, and toccatas. The French suites, however, begin at once with the allemande. Naturally, some of these dances were somewhat altered in the clavier suite. The gigue, for example, which runs to considerable length in the suite, in its original dance form, consisted merely of 2 8-bar phrases with repeats. The Italian composers, as a rule, retained only the meter and rhythm of the various dances, without troubling to preserve their essential character. The French were more scrupulous in this respect, and made a point of pursuing to its conclusion the rhythmical characteristic of each dance form. Bach goes still further. He always vitalizes the form and gives each of the principal dance forms a definite musical personality. For him, the allemande represents vigorous but easy motion. The courante represents a measured haste, in which dignity and elegance go side by side. The sarabande represents a grave and majestic walk. In the gigue, the freest of all forms, the motion is quite fancy-free. He thus raises the suite form to the plane of the highest art, while at the same time he preserves its primitive character as a collection of dance pieces. As with the organ music, so among the clavier works are a number which Bach wrote as teaching pieces for his sons and pupils. His clavier school consisted of the preludes for beginners, the 2-part and 3-part inventions, and the well-tempered clavichord. Of the preludes for beginners, we have altogether 18. 7 are in Friedemann's Klavierbüchlein, 6 more are contained in an old manuscript with the title Six préludes à l'usage des commençants composés par Johann Sebastian Bach. They were published for the first time by Forkel. The others have been handed down to us through pupils. Even in these little works, the overwhelming greatness of Bach is revealed. He merely meant to write a few simple exercises. What he actually wrote were compositions that no one forgets who has once played them, and to which the adult returns with ever new delight. Particularly captivating are the Prelude in C minor, page 119, with its dreamy arpeggio semiquavers, the clear-cut Prelude in D major, page 131, and the jubilant one in E major, page 132, the intoxication of which must have been one of the richest youthful experiences of any one who thoroughly grasped it. The title of the principal autograph of the Inventions and Symphonies runs thus: An honest guide wherewith lovers of the clavier, and especially those anxious to learn, are shown a clear method not only how to learn to play neatly in two parts, but further to play correctly and well in three obbligato parts, and at the same time not only to acquire good invention ideas, but to put them out well, but above all to attain a cantabile style of playing, and in addition to get a strong taste for composition. Written by Johann Sebastian Bach, Anhalt-Köthen, Kapellmeister, Anno Christi 1723. Besides this autograph, we possess two others of an earlier date. Friedemann's Klavierbüchlein, begun in 1720, contains most of these compositions, but the title is different. Instead of invention, we have preambulum, and instead of symphony, we have fantasia. When Bach copied them out again, he altered the arrangement of the pieces. They still follow each other in order of their keys, but to each invention he added the corresponding symphony, which is justified by the fact that the two-part and the three-part pieces, as is shown by certain thematic similarities, were, as a rule, written at the same time. In the definitive autograph, he again distinguished on didactic grounds between two-part and three-part pieces. Here again the final work is a strict selection made by Bach himself from a large number of works of the same kind, relieved by a number of smaller pieces, splinters, as it were, from the workshop. Bach's inability to settle upon the title was due to the absolute novelty of this kind of work. He abandons the binary song form that was customary for small clavier pieces, and which he himself had used in the 6 preludes for beginners, and creates a new form of his own, marked by no external divisions, but giving free play to the natural development of the musical idea. The result was that his invention and manner of working became less melodic than thematic and motival. The same principle would necessarily have led from the da capo aria to the freer song form. Here, however, he never quite won his freedom, though he often seems on the way to it. The title invention for a clavier piece seems not to have been devised by Bach himself, as was formerly thought, but to have been derived from some unknown composer, whose works he copied out at that time for his sons. He might just as well have called all the pieces simply preludes, but he thought this title too general and not sufficiently characteristic for the strict contrapuntal working out that he had in view. The inventions are written not for the clavicembalo, but for the clavichord, which at that time was called simply the clavier. It was only on this instrument that the cantabile style of playing was possible that Bach had chiefly in his mind when writing them. Thus, in the history of pianoforte playing, the inventions and the symphonies are a protest against the dulcimer-like tinkling that was the vogue at that time. And not only at that time. We feel in every bar of these pieces that the idea at the root of them has been the singing and modulatory capacity of the instrument. When Bach penned the title and expressed the hope that these pieces would give players a strong taste for composition, he could not anticipate how amply his wish would be realized. If the average modern musician, in spite of his possessing less theoretical knowledge of the technique of composition than those of Bach's day, at any rate has a clearer sense of the distinction between true and false art, it is primarily due to these little works of Bach. The child who has once practiced them, no matter how mechanically, has acquired a perception of part writing that he will never lose. He will always instinctively look for the same masterly weaving of the voices in every other piece of music, and feel the poverty of the music where this is lacking. And any one who has studied the pieces thoroughly, in their formal and aesthetic aspects under a capable teacher, has henceforth a criterion of true art, whether he himself becomes a composer, or, as in the majority of cases, simply an executant. In any case, Bach's title, with its evident desire that clavier study should not be an end in itself, but an introduction to composition, is of significance to piano teachers today. These outwardly similar compositions fall into certain particular types, which are distinguished from each other according as the development of the piece is purely formal or conditioned by an imperative dramatic idea. The first type is represented by the well-known F major invention, the other by the E minor and F minor symphonies. Closely considered, however, each of these works is a masterpiece sui generis, with no exact analogue among the others. Only an infinitely fertile mind could venture to write 30 little pieces of the same style and the same compass, and without the least effort, make each of them absolutely different from the rest. In face of this inconceivable fertility, it seems almost a superfluous question whether any other of the great composers has had an inventive faculty so infinite as Bach's. The two parts of the Well-Tempered Clavichord belong to widely separated periods. The first was finished in 1722, as appears from the dating of the autograph by Bach himself. The second was compiled in 1744, as we learn from the Hamburg organist Schwenker, who in 1781 made a copy of it from an autograph, now lost, belonging to Emmanuel, the title page which bore the date 1744. In Friedemann's Klavierbüchlein of 1720 are found 11 preludes from the first part, among them the one in C major. Bach's revisions of this and 3 others in C minor, D minor, and E minor made it probable that the majority of the pieces of the Well-Tempered Clavier did not achieve their present perfection at the first stroke, but were continually worked over by the composer with a view to giving them a form that would satisfy him. Gerber, in his dictionary, says that Bach composed the first part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord at a place where time hung heavily on his hands and no musical instrument was available. There may be some truth in this. Gerber's father had been Bach's pupil in the early Leipzig years, so that the tradition may quite well be based on some remarks of Bach's, especially as we know that Gerber was studying the Well-Tempered Clavichord at that time, and Bach himself played it to him thrice. Bach may well have been in such a situation during some journey with Prince Leopold of Cothen, when the small portable clavier that figures in the list of the court instruments would be left behind. The tradition is at any rate correct to this extent, that the majority of pieces in the Well-Tempered Clavichord were written in a relatively short time. This manner of production was indeed characteristic of Bach. The second part was written after he had practically finished with cantata writing. A number of preludes and fugues, however, existed for some time before Bach conceived the idea of a collection. This holds good for the second part no less than for the first. In both there are pieces which, in their original form, really go back almost to the composer's earliest years. Anyone thoroughly conversant with Bach will gradually discover for himself which pieces belong to this category. He will at once see, for example, that of the preludes of the first part, those in C minor and B flat major, do not show the same maturity as most of the others. That the A minor fugue from the same part is a youthful work is shewn not only by a certain thematic looseness and lack of design, but also by the fact that it is evidently written for the pedal clavicembalo. The final note in the bass, prolonged through 5 bars, cannot be sustained by the hands alone, but needs the pedal, as is often the case in the early works. Otherwise, the Well-Tempered Clavichord, like the Inventions and Symphonies, is designed primarily for the clavichord, not for the clavicembalo. Bach himself does not appear to have called the 1744 collection the second part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord, but simply 24 new preludes and fugues. He inscribed the work completed in Cothen, the Well-Tempered Clavichord, by way of celebrating a victory that gave the musical world of that day a satisfaction which we can easily comprehend. On the old keyed instruments it had become impossible to play in all keys, since the fifths and thirds were tuned naturally, according to the absolute intervals given by the division of the string. By this method each separate key was made quite true. The others, however, were more or less out of tune, the thirds and fifths that were right for their own key not agreeing among each other. So a plan had to be found for tuning fifths and thirds not absolutely but relatively, to temper them in such a way that though not quite true in any one key, they would be bearable in all. The question had really become acute in the 16th century, when the new custom arose of allotting a separate string to each note on the clavichord. Previously, the same string had been used for several notes, the tangents dividing the string into the proper lengths for the desired tone. The organ also imperatively demanded a tempered tuning. The question occupied the attention of the Italians Giuseppe Zarlino, 1558, and Pietro Aron, 1529. At a later date, the Halberstadt organ builder Andreas Werkmeister, 1645 to 1706, hit upon a method of tuning that still holds good in principle. He divided the octave into 12 equal semitones, none of which was quite true. His treatise on musical temperament appeared in 1691. The problem was solved. Henceforth composers could write in all keys. A fairly long time elapsed, however, before all the keys hitherto avoided came into practical use. The celebrated theoretician Heineken, in his treatise on thorough bass, published in 1728, that is, 6 years after the origin of Bach's work, confessed that people seldom wrote in B major and A flat major, and practically never in F sharp major and C sharp major, which shows that he did not know Bach's collection of preludes and fugues. At one time it looked as if Bach were to be deprived of the honor of having written the first well-tempered clavichord. In 1880 there came to light a manuscript of one Bernhard Christian Weber, organist at Tennstedt, bearing a very similar title to that of Bach's work, and with the date 1689 in red crayon. The excitement, however, was soon allayed by Wilhelm Tappert's demonstration that the manuscript was not the work of a forerunner, but of a mediocre imitator of the middle of the 18th century. If anyone can be regarded as a forerunner of Bach, it is Mattheson, who in his Organistemprobe 1719, in the article on thorough bass, advocated the employment of all keys, and gave two examples, a difficult one and an easy one in each. When this work appeared, however, Bach was already engaged upon the well-tempered clavichord. Bach found an imitator in his admirer, Georg Andreas Sorge, 1703 to 1788, the Lobenstein organist, who also wrote preludes and fugues in all the 24 keys, and issued the work in 1738 through Bach's publisher, Balthasar Schmidt of Nuremberg. For a long time it was taken for granted that the autograph of the second part of the well-tempered clavichord was lost. In the middle of the 1890s, Sir George Grove and Ebenezer Prout announced that it still existed and had just passed from private hands into the possession of the British Museum. It had come to England through Muzio Clementi, who had acquired it in some unknown way. After his death, it had been bought by a Mr. Emmett, at whose house Mendelssohn saw it in 1842 and recognized it as a genuine autograph. His daughter sold it to her friend Miss Eliza Wesley, who bequeathed it to the British Museum on her death in 1895. It is not the original autograph, but a copy carefully made by Bach himself, in which he had continued each prelude and fugue on a separate sheet in such a way that he did not need to turn over when playing it. Unfortunately, 3 of these leaves are lost. We have several autographs of the first part of the well-tempered clavichord. For each of his 2 elder sons, Bach himself wrote out the work with the utmost care. Friedemann gave his copy to Müller, the cathedral organist at Brunswick, with whom he sometimes stayed after he had given up his post at Halle. It is now in the Berlin Royal Library. Emmanuel's copy was sold in 1802 by his daughter to the Zurich publisher Nageli, and is presumed still in private hands in that city. Another autograph of the year 1722 was once in the possession of a Herr Vogtmann of Pest, where in the middle of the 1840s it was involved in an inundation of the Danube, traces of which it still bears. It is called, after a late owner, the Wagner autograph. There was one copyist in particular who thought it his duty to improve Bach, and tried to do so in every prelude and fugue in both parts. His chief concern was to rid them of all unnecessary complexity, and to give them the form that Bach himself would have conferred on them had he lived in another epoch than that of the Zopf pigtail, and had a more refined taste. He transformed, for example, the D major fugue of the first part in this way. Forkel had a number of the preludes and fugues from each part in a still more drastically curtailed form. It seems almost incredible that he, and after him the Bach biographers Hilgenfeldt and Bitter, should have regarded these versions as the authentic ones, and energetically maintained their superiority over those generally accepted. The children of Bach's muse slink along in the most miserable shapes. They are merely skin and bones. And the man who knew Bach's sons, who had heard them play, and in whom one might presuppose some breath of the Bach spirit, fell a victim to this clumsy deception. Even Zelter had to try his hand at simplifying Bach. So great was the aesthetic suspicion with which people at that time regarded the works of the musical Rococo period, even when they bore the name of Bach. The title of the first part runs thus in the autograph: The well-tempered clavier, or preludes and fugues in all tones and semitones, both with the tertium majorum, or ut re mi, and the tertium minorum, or re mi fa. For the profit and use of young musicians desirous of knowledge, and also of those who are already skilled in the studio, especially by way of pastime, set out and composed by Johann Sebastian Bach, Kapellmeister to the Grand Duke of Anhalt-Köthen, and director of his chamber music, anno 1722. The first edition of the Well-Tempered Clavichord was issued by the Englishman Coleman in 1799. In the following year, the work was issued simultaneously by Nageli of Zurich and Simrock of Bonn. In the latter edition, the second part comes before the first. The first Peter's edition appeared in 1801. Breitkopf and Hartel did not bring it out until 1819. The contemporary Paris and London editions are only pirated reprints of the Nageli version. The first satisfactory text was that of Kroll in the BG edition, 1866. The Well-Tempered Clavichord is one of those works by which we can measure the progress of the artistic culture from one generation to another. When Rochlitz met with these preludes and fugues at the beginning of the 19th century, only a few of them really appealed to him. He placed a tick against these, and was astonished to find how the number of these ticks increased as he played the works. If someone had told this first of Bach prophets that in another 100 years every musically minded man would have regarded each piece in the collection as perfectly easy to comprehend, he would hardly have believed it. The fact that the work today has become common property may console us for the other fact that an analysis of it is almost as impossible as it is to depict a wood by enumerating the trees and describing their appearance. We can only repeat again and again, take them and play them, and penetrate into this world for yourself. Aesthetic elucidation of any kind must necessarily be superficial here. What so fascinates us in the work is not the form or the build of the piece, but the world view that is mirrored in it. It is not so much that we enjoy the Well-Tempered Clavichord as that we are edified by it. Joy, sorrow, tears, lamentation, laughter, to all these it gives voice, but in such a way that we are transported from the world of unrest to a world of peace, and see reality in a new way, as if we were sitting by a mountain lake and contemplating hills and woods and clouds in the tranquil and fathomless water. Nowhere so well as in the Well-Tempered Clavichord are we made to realize that art was Bach's religion. He does not depict natural soul states like Beethoven in his sonatas, no striving and struggling towards a goal, but the reality of life felt by a spirit always conscious of being superior to life, a spirit in which the most contradictory emotions, wildest grief and exuberant cheerfulness, are simply phases of a fundamental superiority of soul. It is this that gives the same transfigured air to the sorrow-laden E-flat minor prelude of the first part, and the carefree volatile prelude in G major in the second part. Whoever has once felt this wonderful tranquillity has comprehended the mysterious spirit that has here expressed all it knew and felt of life in the secret language of tone, and will render Bach the thanks we render only to the great souls to whom it is given to reconcile men with life and bring them peace. Half a dozen connected preludes and fugues and a dozen isolated fugues remained over after the compilation of the Well-Tempered Clavichord, Bach apparently not thinking them important enough to be included in that collection. Two of them, in A major and B minor respectively, are based on themes by Albinoni. Other preludes and fugues were too large and too self-subsistent for it to be possible to include them in a collection. Of this kind are the Fantasia and Fugue in A minor, and the Prelude and Fugue in the same key, which are among the grandest things in piano literature. Later on, Bach rearranged the Prelude and the Fugue with consummate technique, as a concerto for flute, violin, and clavier, with orchestral accompaniment, adding by way of adagio an expanded version of the middle movement of the third organ sonata. The prelude begins thus. And the fugue thus. He notates the later in the orchestral concerto in 4/4 time and combines it with a broad and free tutti. This A minor prelude and fugue probably belonged in their original form to the Cothen period. They certainly existed as early as 1725. It was perhaps rearranged as an orchestral concerto at the beginning of the 30s, when Bach conducted the performances of the Telemann Musical Society and had need of concerted pieces. The fugue in A minor, with its introduction of arpeggio chords, would perhaps be better described as a fugal fantasia. The spirited and brilliant work contains no fewer than 198 bars. The chromatic fantasia and fugue was from the first one of the most popular of Bach's clavier works, as is proved by the many manuscript copies of it that we possess, dating from his own and from later times. The first is found in a volume bearing the date 1730. The work, however, is much older than this. It probably dates from the same epoch, 1720, as the great G minor organ fantasia. It has a kind of inner affinity with this work. Not only does the same peculiar fire burn in each of them, but in both the recitative style is carried over into an instrumental medium. In the C minor fantasia, Bach employs the Neapolitan clavier style that had been founded by Alessandro and Domenico Scarlatti, one of the main effects of which consisted in the crossing of the hands. Bach had already made use of this effect in the Gigue in the B-flat major suite of the first part of the Klavierübung. The C minor fantasia may belong to the same period as the Italian concerto. Perhaps it was written somewhat later, about the end of the 30s. The autograph which we possess points to this period. A fugue was appended to this fantasia, but the autograph unfortunately gives only the first 47 bars of this. They are rich in promise. This does not imply that Bach left it unfinished. It certainly lay before him complete when he made the copy we now have of the C minor fantasia. Only he did not get as far as the copying of the whole fugue. By this accident it is lost to us. This is doubly regrettable, because, judging by the commencement of it, it was a very individual fugue, more in the form of a fantasia. The theme is constructed on one of those chromatic sequences that we so often meet with in Bach's fugues. It runs thus. Four larger works of Bach for the clavier, in several movements, have come down to us in the form of clavier sonatas. Two of these, however, must be deducted, those in A minor and C major, Spita having discovered in 1881 that they are only arrangements and amplifications of instrumental pieces from Adam Reinken's Hortus Musicus. The D minor sonata is only a transcription for the clavier of the second sonata for solo violin. The sonata in D major is therefore the only original composition for the clavier. In this, however, there is hardly any originality, the youthful composer having written it under the influence of Kuhnau's clavier sonatas. In the final fugue he amuses himself by imitating the cackling of a hen, working out this theme. And a counter theme. In merry, if not very witty style. A note in Italian tells us what the piece is meant to represent. 7 clavier compositions in several movements are designated toccatas. They might with equal propriety have been called sonatas. At that time, every piece in several movements for a keyed instrument could be called a toccata, without the title implying anything as to its special form. Of these 7 toccatas, 5, those in D major, D minor, E minor, G minor, and G major, belong to the first Weimar period. The other 2, in F sharp minor and C minor, seem to have been composed somewhat later. As a whole, the G minor toccata is the most interesting. The melancholy adagios of the D minor and the G major toccatas are touching in their simplicity. In the 2 later toccatas, the total impression is somewhat weakened by the lack of finish in the design. In the F sharp minor toccata, we find already the descending chromatic theme that later dominates the crucifixus of the B minor Mass. It is here in the following form. Quite sui generis is a capriccio in B-flat major, probably written in Arnstadt in honor of Bach's second brother Johann Jakob, who had enlisted as an oboist in the Swedish Guard when Charles XII was in Poland in 1704. The 19-year-old Johann Sebastian may have written the capriccio sopra la lontananza del suo fratello dilettissimo, capriccio on the departure of his beloved brother, for the family leave-taking. It begins with an arioso, inscribed casualties of his friends, who try to deter him from his journey. Then comes an andante, meant to be a representation of the diverse accidents that may befall him in foreign lands. The general lamentation of his friends is depicted in a passacaglia like adagissimo on a descending chromatic theme suggesting that of a crucifixus in the B minor Mass. In the following movement, the friends, seeing that it cannot be otherwise, come and say farewell. Thereupon comes the aria of the postilion, and a fugue in imitation of the postilion's horn call ends the delightful work, that follows in the footsteps of Kuhnau's Biblical Histories represented in clavier sonatas, published 4 years earlier, in 1700. A capriccio in E major, that probably belongs to the same period, is not so interesting. It may have been written in honor of his eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach of Ohrdruf, by whom the composer was brought up. Among the clavier pieces are some that Bach designed also for the lute, and were even perhaps written in the first place for that instrument. This is the case with the little prelude in C minor. Recent researches show that the prelude in E flat major, BG 45, page 141, the suite in E minor, BG 45, page 149, that in E major, BG 42, page 16, and that in C minor, BG 45, page 156, are also clavier arrangements of compositions for the lute. The fugue of the G minor sonata for solo violin and the suite discordable for violoncello solo have also come down to us in lute tablature. The 3 Bach partitas for lute mentioned in Breitkopf's catalogue in 1761 are thus not lost, as was almost universally supposed. We may therefore probably answer in the affirmative the question whether Bach himself played the lute. End of chapter 15. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed from the source text available in the public domain by Jonathan Schofield, Birmingham, Alabama.